Welcome to a emergency video pod about the Detroit Lions and Terrion Arnold. So, welcome to Inside the Coach's Office. I'm Coach Barnes, and I just briefly wanted to touch on the Lions releasing Terrion Arnold and what that means going forward. And so, obviously, not an ideal day if you're a Detroit Lions fan, and the it's been proven the NFL doesn't like distractions. Right, obviously, Colin Kaepernick was one, and Brendan Sorsby is a recent example of another one. And so, anytime there's a distraction on an NFL teams and owners and coaches just don't want to deal with it. And so, the Lions today released Terrion Arnold, and they're moving on, and they're back to square one in their secondary. And so, I'm not really going to touch on the legal aspect of it. Obviously, right, there's enough of that out there, but I am kind of curious, who knew what and when. Dan Campbell and the Lions. This first came out in February. The information about kind of what Terrion Arnold was accused of, and Dan Campbell recently made those comments in March about how we're good here and we're going to trust this kid, and I'm going to wait to hear what this kid has to say. But obviously as a coach and as an organization, you're going to stick by your guys, but looking back on it now, that sounds pretty poor. I'm not blaming Dan Campbell or the Lions, so to speak. That just looks poorly, and so that is a frustrating part. And then, if they had any inkling that this was going to happen, would that have changed their draft strategy? Right? I mean, obviously they had a lot of needs, and Blake Miller as an offensive lineman, it's not a bad pick at all because that obviously filled a need. But there were some other secondary guys throughout the draft that they got drafted pretty high. Avion Terrell from Clemson and D'Angelo Pons from Indiana were a couple other guys if they could have potentially drafted if they had an idea, this was going to happen. And so it's a rough situation for the Lions right now. But they have to move on. And obviously they drafted Keith Abney. And if you look at the ESPN.com depth chart right now, he's listed as the starting corner out of Arizona State. And so, yes, they filled that need, but you wonder if they could have potentially drafted a few more guys. And with all the questions in the secondary already with the health of Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph, I know they brought back Avonte Maddox and, Nick Whiteside, but gosh, the one guy who literally could save that draft and could literally save the secondary if he really steps up and plays, where he was drafted, will be Ennis Rakestraw Jr. And the Lions have gotten virtually nothing out of him. And so just an unfortunate situation for this team right now. And it's I mean, I've said it before. No, I don't think this is a make or break year necessarily for Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, obviously, but I mean, their feet to the fire a little bit. I mean, don't kid yourself. This is something that it's a big year, and Dan and I talked about it in our show a lot how the Lions organization and this roster is a top 5 NFL roster, and we believe that, and we believe that the schedule says set up nicely for the Lions to really take a step and do some things and do some damage. And so you hope that they don't get, you hope that this doesn't, bring them down even more, not addressing the secondary more. But, one thing that can help secondary woes historically in football is if you get good production, from your front 7, especially your front 4. And, you're hoping Talik Williams takes that step now as a second-year guy with the Lions. And then, the draft pick out of Michigan, Derek Moore. I know he's more of a and rush linebacker type guy. But if you get production from those guys, that's going to help, negate any issues you have in the secondary. But, it's funny. I was looking back through the history really quick of the Lions drafting cornerbacks. And, and off the top of my head, besides Terrion Arnold, you questioned some things, was Terry Fair. The Lions took him right before Randy Moss was picked. And I know the Lions didn't have a heavy need at receiver that year, but gosh, Randy Moss is considered one of the best receivers of all time, and he'd have been something to have in their organization. Jeff Okudah, obviously everybody knows about and still talks about, and Bryant Westbrook. So for whatever reason, the Lions draft history has not been great with the cornerbacks, and just add Terrion Arnold to that list. And so Is the sky falling? No. Are the Lions, like I said, a top 5 roster in the NFL? We believe that. We believe good things are going to happen, but gosh, it doesn't. It doesn't help. And so, you just hope that the organization had a plan for it. Like I said, or maybe they knew this was going to happen, or maybe they felt good about their secondary, regardless of what was going to happen with the Terrion Arnold situation. But that's really all I wanted to talk about, guys. Thanks for listening, and catch Dan and I again inside the coach's office this Sunday at 7 p.m., and we'll see you then.